Hello and welcome to the full Bridgend review. This review will show you what you can expect if you travel to Bridgend and its nearby historical sites. These places include Bridgend's town centre and estates, Ogmore by Sea and Dunraven Bay, along with 5 historic castles. These include Newcastle Castle, Coety Castle, the Ogmore Castle, Castleton's Castle, and Dunraven's Castle, as well as Ewenny Priory, which is a fortified monastery. I will then provide my personal perspective when visiting each location, as well as general guidance on how you can reach them yourself. I will also discuss the history surrounding each location in Bridgend, and believe me, Bridgend has a lot of history to its name. Let's start off with the main town of Bridgend itself. Bridgend's town and surrounding areas had a population of over 51,000 people as of 2021 onwards. However, the Bridgend County Borough itself consisted of over 147,000 people as of mid-2024, marking a 4.5% increase from 2021. Bridgend is situated at the midpoint between Cardiff and Swansea, near the southernmost part of Wales. A train from Cardiff to Bridgend costs less than £8 for a return, so I would strongly recommend travelling by train. Alternatively, you can also take a bus and pay £7 for a day to go on the X2 from Cardiff to Bridgend, but this will take you at least 1 hour and 10 minutes, so I would personally recommend taking a train for a faster journey at roughly the same price. Every time I visited Bridgend, I immediately noticed that there was a much more emphasised Welsh accent when compared to Cardiff and its surrounding towns. Similarly, Bridgend, like most Welsh towns, is very warm and welcoming, but this is easier to recognise in Bridgend. For example, when I got off the train, the ticketer at the train station immediately let me know without hesitation that I had £20 hanging out of my pocket. She definitely did not need to tell me this, but it was a kind gesture. I also walked into a shop, and the shopkeeper was fairly keen on chatting. This is something which is perhaps less common in Cardiff. The people of Bridgend are typically street smart, and most of the youth generally get on well together, perhaps more so than other Welsh towns. But it's hard to say if it's completely safe here. I did notice somebody midday drinking, and there has been a couple of homeless people found near the town centre, although not too many. As expected, Bridgend also had a more abundant elderly demographic from what I observed while walking around. When interviewing a man in his 20s in Bridgend, he mentioned that Bridgend does lack facilities for young people to come together, resulting in more children gathering together near the town centre. If anything, more facilities for young people would majorly benefit this small town, perhaps even attracting a younger crowd altogether. The man also mentioned that it is common for younger people to travel away to find work elsewhere in the UK, which is sad to hear given that Bridgend seems perfectly fine to live at. The town's economy has diminished over the years. Many of the shops in Bridgend have closed down or have been replaced altogether, following the same fate as many of the other towns in South Wales. But Bridgend was not always like this, and it was once a very prosperous small town. Bridgend was initially a well-established market town for trading, and grew between the 16th and 19th centuries. In 1801, there were only 6,000 residents, growing to 61,000 residents by the early 20th century as a result of industrialisation. During World War II, Bridgend employed up to 40,000 people in a large munitions factory at Waterloo, named the ROF Bridgend. Bridgend also had a prisoner of war camp, which was named the Island Farm. As of the 1970s onwards, many renovations took place to improve the area of Bridgend. The addition of a new industrial estate, new connections between Bridgend and the M4 motorway, and the introduction of new houses from the Brackla housing estate resulted in a population boom in the 1980s. But since this period, there has been a clear decline. The employment rate was only 67% in 2024, which was the lowest it ever was. This was most likely as a result of the indoor shopping centre closing down in 2023. But when looking around Bridgend, it is clear that many of the niche markets have closed down in favour of the many generic high street chains we see today. But Bridgend remains an optimistic prospect economically, and during December of 2025, Bridgend received 1.7 million through the Welsh Government's Transforming Towns programme. Additionally, many housing developments are currently taking place in Bridgend. One example is how Park Llangwennydd is bringing an additional 850 homes to the western end of Bridgend, which was announced in September of 2025. So Bridgend is generally doing quite well overall. In terms of housing costs, a one-bedroom flat to buy would cost, at the lowest, less than £95,000, which is a relatively fair price if you ask me. At lowest, a one-bedroom flat to rent may cost £525 per month, which in my eyes is more affordable compared to renting in Cardiff. I would definitely consider Bridgend itself to be a somewhat decent place to live for a great quality of life, especially with the nearby beaches. Bridgend features many castle ruins which make up the surrounding areas. In particular, Newcastle Castle, Coety Castle, and the Ogmore Castle were built to act as a defensive triangle to watch over the Ogmore River. If ever the event that one of these three castles were under attack, the other two castles could signal for defensive reinforcements. The first castle I explored was Newcastle Castle, which can be found near the city centre. Newcastle Castle was first built as a ringwork in the year 1106 by William de Londres, who was one of the 12 Knights of Glamorgan, to secure control of the area. This was later renovated with stone and a well-designed doorway in 1180, either by William Fitz-Robert or King Henry II. It was confirmed, however, to be owned by King Henry II from 1183 onwards. Newcastle Castle was repossessed many times throughout the decades leading on from this. Ironically, there were no accounts of major sieges taking place at Newcastle Castle directly, even though the surrounding areas of Bridgend did face continuous uprisings. From 1217 onwards, the Tuberville family, who were prominent Marcher lords, took ownership of Newcastle Castle until 1360, when ownership was passed on to the Gamage family. Eventually, in 1584, Barbara Gamage relocated to Kent and eventually married the Earl of Leicester, Robert Sidney, leaving the castle generally unused. It was then sold as an estate to Samuel Edwin in 1718. It was around this time that the castle began turning into a derelict structure. When looking at the walls, you will notice that the stones have been pulled apart from the structure. This is because the castle was a good source of Sutton stone, with the castle slowly deteriorating. As a result of this, the stone was taken and used for other local constructions instead. You can definitely get a great view of the surrounding area from this vantage point. But other than that, this castle is a bit lackluster in its size and appearance compared to the other castles found in Bridgend, which I will be discussing next. The next castle, which is part of the Ogmore Triangle, is Coety Castle, which can be found at the northeast end of Bridgend. Coety Castle first began as a ringwork, similar to Newcastle Castle, in the late 11th century. It was then turned into a stone fortress by Sir Payne de Tuberville in 1126, who was one of the 12 Knights of Glamorgan. The Tubervilles maintained possession of Coety across many generations, until it was repossessed by Sir Lawrence Berkelos of East Orchard in 1384, who married Lady Catherine Tuberville. This was due to the fact that the Tubervilles never had a male heir, so this marital arrangement allowed Lawrence Berkelos to be a successor for the Tubervilles and possess Coety Castle. Impressively, Lawrence Berkeros also held off a 2-year siege against Owain Glyndwr's revolt of 1404. This was because the castle's defences at the time were more modernised than the other surrounding castles, and could withstand relentless siege attempts. Coety Castle did, however, suffer heavy damage from the siege attempts. After 1411, the castle was passed on to the Gamage family, who continued renovating Coety Castle. Coety Castle followed the same fate as Newcastle Castle after Barbara Gamage left the castle behind in 1584, to eventually marry the Earl of Leicester in Kent, Robert Sidney. The Sidney family owned the castle until the 19th century, but it was never occupied and was left to ruin over time. In my opinion, Coety Castle is much more spacious than Newcastle Castle, and much of the castle's remains are still present. It's the sort of place that appears as if it would contain ancient long-lost relics. Perhaps it would even be a good place to create a medieval film. The next castle you can find is the Ogmore Castle, which is found just southwest of Bridgend, near Merthyr Mawr. The castle was first constructed as a ringwork at around 1106, and was given to William de Londres, who also owned Newcastle Castle, but not Coety Castle. In 1116, William fled the castle when the Welsh appeared to attack the Ogmore Castle. William's butler Arnold held off against the Welsh revolt, and as a result was knighted for his bravery and given the Dunraven castle and manor as a reward. After the attack, William decided to reconstruct Ogmore Castle out of stone, with new stone renovations taking place until the beginning of the 13th century. After the Welsh conquests were pulled further west, the castle lost its defensive importance, eventually losing its militaristic role in the late 13th century. The Ogmore Castle was, however, repurposed, acting as a centre for administration and justice. The castle remained in the Londres family until 1224, when Haywise married Patrick de Chaworth. Their daughter, Maud de Chaworth, married Henry of Lancaster, who was the youngest son of the Earl of Lancaster. This meant that by 1399, when Henry Bolingbroke took the throne, the castle became property of the crown. The castle also suffered great damage from the Owain Glyndwr revolt of 1404, and was repaired until around the 1440s. In 1454, a court was placed in the outer ward of the castle, which was used until the early 19th century. The castle was rendered as ruin towards the end of the late 18th century. In my opinion, the Ogmore Castle is pretty large, is spacious and has many tall walls, similar to the ruins of Coety Castle. The castle looked truly majestic when the sun was setting though. In my opinion, this is a great castle to sit down and unwind by after a long day of hiking, as you can even find benches here. Historically, Bridgend also featured one of the most fortified monasteries in Wales. This place was known as Ewenny Priory, which was founded in the 12th century around a church dating from the year 1120. The priory consisted of a 600-yard long stone wall, which featured 6 towers, 5 of which are still standing today. The priory was converted into a private house, which is still occupied today by the Picton Tuberville bloodline. Isn't it fascinating how the Tuberville bloodline still persists in 2026? The Priory Church is still accessible to the public in Ewenny Priory, as Cadw only owns the eastern end of the church. While the surrounding buildings are privately owned, you can still book the private house for wedding events. If you do decide to explore this historic site, respect the privacy of the residents and avoid exploring beyond the gate. I personally would recommend visiting the other historic sites which I mentioned in this video, as they are generally easier to access and there is much more to see. Just past the Ogmore River, you will find the ruins of Candleston Castle, which was fortified much later than the other castles in Bridgend, in the 1320s by John de Canterlope. This was then passed on to Richard Craddock in 1468, and a major refurbishment took place by Matthew Craddock in the year 1500. Candleston Castle's elevated position allowed it to survive from being encroached by sand dunes. The castle was eventually passed on to the Herbert family name, after Margaret Craddock, Matthew's only heir, married Richard Herbert. This carried on through many generations of the Herbert family until Mary Herbert married William Doddington around the early 17th century. The castle then passed on to the Greville family until it was sold to the Franklin family in the 1700s. In the 1800s, Candleston Castle was even used as a farmhouse. But later, in the 1800s, after people moved out, the castle became a ruin. My personal take on this castle is that it is very eerie, but this was likely because I visited the castle quite late in the afternoon when the sun was down. One thing that actually freaked me out a little was the lit candle, yet there was nobody in sight. I was more cautious about this castle than the others, as it seemed completely abandoned with vines and graffiti everywhere. Although the castle does have a good reputation, it should also be noted that this castle is situated right next to Candleston Woods and the Merthyr Mawr National Nature Reserve, which I would also recommend visiting with family or friends for an amazing day out. The final castle, known as Dunraven's Castle, is found just beyond the outskirts of Bridgend, nearby Ogmore by Sea, which is a luscious beach retreat. To get here, you must take the 303 from Bridgend's city centre. This takes you directly to the area where Dunraven's Castle is situated. Additionally, you can also use the 303 to reach the Ogmore Castle. Dunraven's Castle was personally my favourite castle to explore, but it wasn't so much the castle which fascinated me the most. As you descend from the cliff, which, mind you, is very steep and dangerous, the view of the rigid cliffs were pretty spectacular. If you really want to connect with nature, Dunraven Bay is arguably the best spot in Bridgend to do so. But just to warn you in advance, there is paid parking here if you do decide to go by car. There is an ice cream truck near the entrance, along with a beach and rock pool. The castle itself is found along a path further from the beach, but you won't need to walk far to get there. As mentioned earlier, Dunraven Castle was owned and built by Arnold Butler after he defended the Ogmore Castle from a siege. It was constructed by him in the mid-12th century. By the 16th century, the castle became a manor house and was owned by the Vaughan family. This was then passed on to the Wyndham family in 1642, with one of the family members, Thomas Wyndham, becoming the MP for Glamorgan in 1786. He transformed the manor house into a hunting lodge from 1802 to 1806, which was designed by his wife. Thomas's daughter, Caroline, then married a man named Wyndham Henry Quinn in 1810. Interestingly, this structure lasted much longer than the other castles which were previously mentioned. In 1858, Caroline remodelled the castle and added a conservatory. The place was occupied until it was transformed into a military hospital for use in the Second World War, and was eventually demolished in 1963. The castle definitely does feel like a manor house more than a rocky fortress. There are about 3 rectangular sections you could walk through. When you reach the 3rd section, there was a massive open patch of grass in the centre. I immediately thought that this spot would be great for hosting a medieval duel. Beyond the castle, there is another dangerous yet fascinating cliffside view. But as you continue walking along the path and up the hill, there is a vantage point where you can get a fantastic view of the surrounding area. By this time of the day, it was becoming very misty, so the footage resembled something closer to the aftermath of a war instead of a sunny retreat. Lastly, you have Ogmore by Sea. This luscious beach was notorious for having shipwrecks, with rumours of more than 300 shipwrecks being buried under the sand. This was caused by a dangerous reef known as the Tusker Rock, which claimed many vessels during the late 19th century and beyond. However, this area clearly has a lot of treasures hidden within. One recent example in December of 2025 was when hundreds of black leather Victorian shoes were discovered to be washed ashore on this very beach. The population of Ogmore by Sea generally has increased from an estimate of 878 in 2011 to 1,302 in 2024 as a result of housing developments. But surprisingly, the population is mainly comprised of individuals over 50 years old, with people in my age bracket, aged between 20 to 29, only making up 72 people. Perhaps it really is time to incentivize younger adults to live in amazing places such as this one. If you have any questions about Bridgend and the surrounding areas, I will be responding to comments. Thank you for watching.